The applause was still echoing when Dean Martin stepped away from the lights. It followed him like a lingering ghost, hands clapping, laughter rolling, the soft hum of admiration that always seemed to float in the air after he left a stage. The hallway behind the curtain was narrower, dimmer, and smelled faintly of coffee and old wood. Here, the laughter dissolved into something else. Quiet, purposeful footsteps, murmured conversations, the low buzz of a studio winding down. Dean loosened his tie slightly, not out of discomfort but habit. It was a small ritual, a way of telling himself the performance was over. On stage, he had been Dean Martin, the smooth voice, the effortless grin, the man who made it all look easy. Back here, he was just a man in his late years, shoulders carrying more than the public ever knew. He nodded politely to a stagehand, returned a smile to a young assistant who looked like she wanted to say something but didn't. Everyone always wanted something from him, an autograph, a joke, a memory they could carry home. Tonight, though, something felt different. He could feel it in the way the air sat heavy in his chest. A producer caught up to him near the dressing rooms. "Dean," the man said carefully, lowering his voice, "there's someone who was hoping to meet you." Dean paused. This wasn't unusual. There was always someone. But the hesitation in the producer's tone, measured, almost cautious, made Dean turn fully toward him. "Who is it?" Dean asked. The producer cleared his throat. "A child. He's here with his mother. Well, he's not doing very well. They didn't want to interrupt. Thought maybe if you had a moment." Dean didn't respond right away. In his career, he had learned how quickly moments could become performances if handled the wrong way. Sympathy could turn into spectacle. Kindness could be mistaken for showmanship. He had spent years perfecting the art of appearing light while keeping the heavier things private. "How old?" Dean asked quietly. 10, maybe 11. Dean exhaled slowly. "Where are they?" The producer gestured down the hallway toward a small room usually reserved for guests waiting between segments. "Back there." Dean nodded once. "All right." No flourish, no announcement, just a decision. The room was smaller than Dean expected. A single couch sat against the wall, its fabric faded from years of use. A low table held a paper cup of water and a folded napkin. The overhead light buzzed faintly, as if unsure of its own purpose. Sitting on the couch was a woman in her 30s, posture stiff, hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were pale. Beside her sat a boy. He was thinner than most children his age, but not in a way that called attention to itself. His eyes were large and alert, the kind of eyes that watched more than they spoke. He wore a jacket that looked slightly too big, sleeves extending past his wrists. On his lap rested a small notebook, edges worn as if it had been opened and closed many times. When the door opened, the woman looked up first. Her eyes widened, not with excitement but with disbelief. She stood quickly, unsure whether she should. "Oh, Mr. Martin," she said, voice trembling. I am so sorry, we didn't mean to." "It's all right," Dean said gently, lifting a hand to stop her apology before it could finish. "Please sit." She hesitated, then sat back down. The boy stared at Dean, unblinking. Dean had met thousands of fans in his lifetime. Most came with expectations, stories rehearsed in their heads, admiration worn proudly on their faces. This boy looked at him differently. There was no awe, no starstruck excitement, just curiosity, and something else Dean recognized all too well, caution. Dean knelt slightly, so he wasn't towering over him. "Hi there," he said. "I'm Dean." The boy blinked, then after a moment he nodded. "I know." Dean smiled, not the stage smile, but the small, private one he reserved for moments like this. "What's your name?" "Samuel," the boy replied. His voice was soft but steady. "That's a good name," Dean said. "Strong." Samuel considered this, as if weighing whether he agreed. The woman wiped at her eyes discreetly. "He didn't think you'd actually come," she said quietly. "I told him it was a long shot." Dean shifted his attention to her. "I'm glad I did." He looked back at Samuel. "Your mom tells me you wanted to meet me." Samuel nodded again. "My dad used to play your records." "Used to." Dean didn't miss the past tense. "Your dad had good taste," Dean said lightly. Samuel's lips twitched, almost a smile. "That's what he said." Silence settled in the room, not awkward, just real. Dean didn't rush to fill it. Years in entertainment had taught him that the most meaningful moments often happened when you stopped trying so hard. Dean glanced at the notebook on Samuel's lap. What's that? Samuel looked down at it, fingers tightening slightly around the cover. It's things I write. Songs, Dean asked. Sometimes, Samuel said, mostly thoughts. Dean raised an eyebrow. Those are the hardest ones to write. Samuel looked up at him then, surprised. Yeah, he said, they are. Dean sat down in a chair across from them. Mind if I hear one? Samuel hesitated. He looked at his mother, who nodded gently. The boy opened the notebook carefully, as if it might fall apart if handled roughly. He flipped to a page marked by a bent corner. I don't usually read them out loud, Samuel said. You don't have to, Dean replied. Only if you want to. Samuel took a breath. When I'm quiet, he began, people think I'm scared, but I'm not. I'm just listening, sometimes to the room, sometimes to myself, sometimes to the parts of people they don't say out loud. The words hung in the air, fragile and powerful all at once. Dean felt something tighten in his chest. That's beautiful, he said honestly. Samuel shrugged. It's just how it feels. Dean leaned back slightly, studying the boy. Not as a celebrity, not even as an adult looking at a child, but as one human recognizing another who had learned something early that most people never fully grasped. You know, Dean said after a moment, people think singing is about the voice, but it's not. It's about listening first. Samuel looked at him with new interest. Listening to what? Everything, Dean said. The silence, the pain, the joy people don't know how to explain. If you can hear that, you can sing anything. Samuel closed the notebook slowly. Can I ask you something? He said. Of course. Do you ever get scared? Samuel asked. The question wasn't casual. It wasn't curious. It was serious. The kind of question only someone who had faced fear personally could ask without flinching. Dean didn't answer right away. Yes, he said finally, more than people think. Samuel nodded, as if that confirmed something important. I'm scared sometimes too, he said, but I don't want people to feel bad. Dean leaned forward again. Feeling bad isn't the worst thing, he said softly. Feeling nothing is. The boy absorbed that. The woman's shoulders shook quietly as she looked away, giving them space. Dean checked his watch, not because he was in a hurry, but because he realized something else. He had no intention of leaving. Outside the room, the studio lights dimmed. The laughter from earlier was already fading into memory, replaced by the quieter rhythm of a night ending. Inside, three people sat together, not as star and fans, not as performer and audience, but as strangers briefly connected by honesty. Dean didn't know yet that this meeting would stay with him longer than most performances ever had. And Samuel didn't know that this was only the beginning of something neither of them had planned. But in that quiet room behind the laughter, something real had begun. Something no applause could ever match. The hallway outside the small room slowly emptied as the studio night settled into its familiar routine, the kind that followed every taping, and yet never quite felt the same twice. Crew members wrapped cables with practiced hands, assistants whispered into clipboards, and somewhere down the corridor, a door shut with a soft finality that suggested the evening's laughter had officially concluded. Inside the room, however, time seemed to stretch in a way Dean Martin had rarely experienced. He had spent decades living by tight schedules, cues, and rehearsed beats, but none of that mattered now. The chair beneath him felt heavier, as though it were anchoring him to the moment, refusing to let him drift back into the comfortable rhythm of performance and escape. Samuel sat quietly, his notebook resting closed on his lap, his fingers tracing the worn edges as if the object itself offered reassurance. Dean noticed the way the boy listened even when no one was speaking, the way his attention moved subtly between the room, his mother, and Dean himself. There was an attentiveness there that didn't belong to someone so young, a patience forged not by choice but by circumstance. Dean recognized it instantly, because he had seen it before, not in children, but in people who had learned that life did not always move at the pace they wanted. Dean shifted slightly in his seat, careful not to disturb the calm that had settled over them. He knew instinctively that this wasn't a moment to dominate with stories or humor, no matter how natural that instinct was to him. Instead, he let the silence breathe, trusting that if something needed to be said, it would find its way out on its own. The woman sitting beside Samuel watched Dean closely, as if afraid this fragile pocket of peace might vanish if she blinked too long. Her face held exhaustion, yes, but also something fiercer, a quiet vigilance that only comes from loving someone you cannot protect from everything. After a long pause, Dean spoke again, his voice low and unhurried, as though he were careful not to scare the moment away. He told Samuel about the first time he had stood on a stage and felt his hands shake despite the smile he wore, about how people assume confidence comes from knowing you won't fail, when in reality it comes from learning how to stand still even when you're afraid. He didn't dress the memory up with jokes or soften it with bravado. He told it plainly because Samuel had earned honesty, and because anything less would have felt like a betrayal. Samuel listened intently, his eyes never leaving Dean's face, absorbing each word as if it were a small tool he might need later. When Dean finished, Samuel didn't respond right away. He seemed to consider the weight of what had been shared, turning it over quietly in his mind. Finally, he asked whether Dean ever wished he could step away from being recognized everywhere he went, whether there were days when he wanted to be invisible. The question landed gently but firmly, and Dean felt its truth settle into him like a familiar ache. Dean admitted that there were moments when fame felt less like a gift and more like a barrier, something that stood between him and ordinary human connection. He explained that people often saw the image before they saw the person, and that it could be lonely to be known by millions yet truly understood by very few. As he spoke, he noticed Samuel's mother lower her gaze, her expression shifting as though those words resonated in a place she hadn't expected. Loneliness, Dean realized, wore many faces, and none of them cared whether you were famous or not. There was a gentle knock at the door, barely loud enough to interrupt the quiet. Dean turned to see Johnny Carson standing just outside the frame, his presence understated, his demeanor markedly different from the confident host the audience had seen moments earlier. He didn't enter right away, didn't crack a joke or draw attention to himself. Instead, he waited, reading the room with the same sensitivity that had made him such a master of conversation on air. Dean stood and greeted him warmly, the two men exchanging a look that carried years of mutual respect without a word needing to be said. Johnny nodded toward Samuel and his mother, his expression softening as Dean quietly explained why he was there. Johnny didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, pulled a chair closer, and sat down at eye level with Samuel, introducing himself simply without titles or flourish. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the kind of man he was when the cameras were off. Johnny spoke less than Dean, but when he did, his words were deliberate and thoughtful. He told Samuel that some of the bravest people he had ever met were those who showed up honestly even when life was unfair, and that courage didn't always look loud or dramatic. Sometimes, he said, it looked like listening, or writing, or simply continuing to care when it would be easier to shut down. Samuel's fingers tightened around his notebook at those words, and Dean could tell that something had landed exactly where it needed to. As the conversation continued, Dean felt a shift within himself, a quiet realization forming beneath the surface. This wasn't a meeting he could walk away from unchanged. He had come expecting to offer a brief kindness, a memory for a child who admired his work. Instead, he found himself receiving something far rarer, a reminder of why art, music, and presence mattered at all. He understood then that fame could open doors, but it was what you did once you stepped through them that defined their worth. The studio outside the room had nearly gone silent by the time Dean finally stood again. The night had grown late, but none of them seemed eager to acknowledge it. Dean looked at Samuel, at the steady calm in his eyes, and made a decision that he did not announce, not even to himself. It settled into him quietly, like a promise waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. As Dean said his goodbyes, he knelt once more in front of Samuel, placing a gentle hand over the boy's notebook, and telling him to keep writing, not because the words needed to impress anyone, but because they mattered simply by existing. Samuel nodded, his expression serious, as though he understood that this advice was less about writing and more about living. When Dean finally stepped back into the hallway, the weight in his chest hadn't lifted, but it had changed. It no longer felt like heaviness alone. It felt like responsibility. And as he walked toward the exit, the echo of applause long gone, Dean Martin knew with absolute certainty that the most important thing he would do that night had nothing to do with music, laughter, or the audience at home. What came next would not be public, and it would not be easy. The drive away from the studio unfolded in near silence, the city lights blurring softly beyond the windshield as Dean Martin sat in the back seat, his coat folded neatly beside him, his hands resting loosely in his lap. The driver glanced at him once through the mirror, likely expecting a request for music or conversation, but Dean offered neither. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the quiet moments from the small room again and again, not as memories exactly, but as something closer to a responsibility that had followed him out into the night. For most of his life, he had been able to step away from the stage and leave its echoes behind, but this was different. This wasn't applause fading into memory. This was a presence that stayed. Dean had always believed that time revealed what truly mattered, yet he was struck by how swiftly clarity had arrived this evening. Samuel's calm voice, his careful words, the way he listened more than he spoke, all of it had pierced through layers Dean hadn't realized he was still carrying. Fame had taught him how to protect parts of himself, how to keep the deeper questions at a safe distance, but children like Samuel had a way of bypassing those defenses without trying. They didn't demand answers. They simply asked the right questions and waited. When Dean reached home, the quiet there felt heavier than usual. The house, elegant and familiar, had seen countless gatherings, laughter-filled evenings, and celebrations that blurred together over the years. Tonight, however, it felt almost too still, as if the walls themselves were waiting. Dean poured himself a drink out of habit, then set it aside untouched, realizing he didn't want the comfort of routine to dull what he was feeling. Instead, he sat down, closed his eyes, and allowed the weight of the evening to settle fully into him. He thought of the promises people made without speaking them, the kind that formed not from obligation but from recognition. Dean understood then that kindness was not always about grand gestures or public moments. Often, it was about showing up again quietly when no one was watching. He had spent decades being generous in ways the world could see: benefits, appearances, charitable events. But this felt like something that demanded discretion, humility, and continuity. This was not about being remembered. It was about remembering someone else. Over the following days, Dean found himself reaching out carefully, deliberately, ensuring that no attention followed his actions. He asked questions through the right channels, listened more than he spoke, and made it clear that whatever he chose to do would be done with respect for privacy above all else. He did not want Samuel to become a story or a symbol. He wanted him to remain a boy whose dignity mattered more than any narrative that could be built around him. During one quiet afternoon, Dean received a call from Johnny Carson, whose voice carried none of the humor audiences knew so well. Johnny spoke plainly, acknowledging that some meetings stayed with you long after the cameras stopped rolling, and that this one had done exactly that. He didn't pry, didn't ask what Dean planned to do, but he offered something far more valuable: understanding without expectation. The conversation ended with no promises exchanged, only a shared silence that said more than words ever could. Dean arranged to see Samuel again, this time away from studios and schedules, in a setting that felt neutral and unremarkable. There were no assistants hovering, no producers nearby, no sense of performance. Just a quiet space, a table between them, and the same notebook resting in Samuel's hands. The boy seemed less surprised this time, as if part of him had known that the meeting before hadn't been the end. They spoke about writing, about music, about the strange way time seemed to move differently depending on how you were feeling. Dean listened closely, careful not to steer the conversation, allowing Samuel to lead it wherever it naturally went. At one point, Samuel asked Dean whether people ever regretted the chances they didn't take, the words they kept to themselves because they were afraid of being misunderstood. The question lingered, and Dean felt its truth resonate deeply. He admitted that regret rarely came from what went wrong, but from what was never attempted at all. He told Samuel that fear had a way of disguising itself as practicality, convincing people to stay still when movement was what they needed most. Samuel absorbed this quietly, his expression thoughtful, as though he were storing the idea away for later reflection. As weeks passed, Dean noticed something unexpected within himself. The pressure he had always felt to remain entertaining, charming, and effortlessly composed had loosened its grip. In its place was a steadier sense of purpose, one that didn't rely on approval or applause. He began to understand that legacy was not something you crafted intentionally. It was something that formed naturally from the care you showed when it was inconvenient, private, and unacknowledged. This realization did not come with pride. It came with humility. There were difficult moments too, moments when Dean questioned whether his presence truly helped or whether it risked complicating an already fragile situation. Each time doubt surfaced, he returned to the same guiding principle: listen first. Samuel never asked for promises, never demanded more than what was freely given. That restraint, that quiet strength, reminded Dean that the most meaningful support was often invisible. One evening, as Dean sat alone once more, he reflected on how easily life divided itself into before and after moments without announcing the shift. He had not planned for this chapter, had not sought it out, yet here it was, reshaping him in subtle but undeniable ways. He realized that kindness, when practiced sincerely, asked something in return, not gratitude, not recognition, but commitment. It asked you to remain present even when the outcome was uncertain. Dean Martin had built a career on making things look easy, on smoothing the rough edges of life with melody and charm. But now, in the quiet spaces between performances, he was learning something far more challenging and far more meaningful. That being fully human required staying with discomfort, honoring vulnerability, and choosing compassion even when it offered no clear resolution. And as this understanding settled into him, Dean knew that whatever the future held, he would carry this lesson forward, not as a story to be told, but as a way of being lived. Time, as Dean Martin slowly came to understand, did not announce its most important moments. It passed quietly, almost politely, allowing people to believe they were still in control until they looked back and realized something essential had shifted. In the months that followed his meeting with Samuel, Dean continued his public life with the same professionalism audiences expected, yet something fundamental had changed beneath the surface. Applause still came, interviews still ended with laughter, and the familiar rhythm of performance carried on, but none of it occupied the same central space in his heart. There was now a deeper awareness accompanying him everywhere, a steady reminder that meaning was not measured by how many people saw you, but by how fully you showed up when it mattered. Dean never spoke publicly about Samuel, not because the story lacked significance, but because its value came precisely from being private. Their meetings remained quiet and unadorned, marked not by grand gestures but by consistency. Sometimes they talked about music and writing, sometimes about nothing in particular, and sometimes they simply sat together, sharing the kind of silence that did not need to be filled. Dean learned that presence, when offered sincerely, did not require solutions or answers. It required patience, humility, and the willingness to stay even when there was nothing left to say. As Samuel's world continued to narrow in ways neither of them could control, Dean became increasingly aware of how society struggled with stillness, especially when it brushed against vulnerability. People often reached for inspiration, for lessons neatly packaged with hopeful endings, but real life did not operate that way. Dean refused to force meaning where it did not naturally arise. Instead, he focused on honoring the moments exactly as they were, believing that authenticity, even when painful, was a form of respect. Samuel, in his own quiet way, seemed to understand this better than most adults ever could. One evening, after a particularly long day, Dean received a message from Johnny Carson, brief and thoughtful, expressing gratitude for the reminder that kindness did not need an audience. The note contained no follow-up questions, no commentary, just acknowledgement. Dean appreciated that more than Johnny likely realized. It affirmed something Dean had come to believe deeply, that the most meaningful acts often happened beyond the reach of cameras, applause, or even memory. They lived on not as stories told, but as changes quietly carried forward. When the time came that Dean sensed Samuel was growing tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, he did not panic or rush to fill the space with reassurance. Instead, he listened, allowing Samuel to speak about his thoughts with the same calm honesty he had always shown. Samuel spoke about fear without drama, about hope without illusion, and about love without sentimentality. He talked about his mother, about the notebook he had filled with words, and about how meeting Dean had helped him understand that being heard mattered more than being remembered. Dean listened, feeling the full weight of the moment without trying to lighten it, knowing instinctively that this was what respect looked like in its purest form. Afterward, Dean returned home and sat alone for a long time, not seeking distraction or comfort. He thought about the decades he had spent perfecting an image that made life look effortless, and how a single quiet connection had revealed the depth that existed beyond that image. He realized that legacy was not something left behind intentionally, but something woven unconsciously through the way one treated others when there was nothing to gain. Fame, he understood now, was fleeting not because it faded, but because it was never the point to begin with. In the years that followed, those closest to Dean noticed subtle changes. He listened more, he spoke less. His humor softened, carrying a warmth that felt less performative and more present. When asked about success, he deflected gently, steering conversations away from achievements and toward gratitude. Those who truly paid attention sensed that he had been shaped by something profound, though few ever knew exactly what it was. Dean never corrected them. He had learned that some truths did not belong to explanation. Long after the lights dimmed for the final time and Dean Martin's voice lived on through recordings rather than rooms, the impact of his quiet choices continued in ways unseen. Not in headlines or retrospectives, but in the private courage of a boy who had learned that his thoughts mattered, and in the enduring understanding that kindness, when practiced without performance, could outlast even the brightest spotlight. And in the end, when all the laughter faded and the stages stood empty, what remained was not the sound of applause, but the echo of a moment when one human truly saw another and chose, without hesitation, to stay.